Now we're entering in the second stage of our discussion, in which we will be addressing, panelists will be addressing each other and the comments they want to make on the issue that has been raised. I know what order we should use. Probably we'll go the same order as we started. Marta, would you start?
Well, I was very impressed by my fellow panelists in all the work that is being done in the field of Ukrainian studies, especially as far as the most recent generation is concerned. I'm just wondering if there are enough specialists, or if there are enough people interested in Ukrainian studies. The problem I saw in the United States is, Rory, you are right, a very slight presence of Ukrainian topics in general publications, even within the Slavic field. For some reason, I think the things that make us as a Ukrainian society strong are the things that also tend to undermine our effectiveness. And that is the amount of time that one has to spend on internal Ukrainian issues, social issues, or other issues, limits the time and the interest that we have available for general issues. One of the things that when I was running the program on translations, that was very difficult to explain to scholars who were requesting funds, for instance, to translate the basic documents of the Iranian culture, was to convince them that they should explain why precisely this document, why precisely this thing, why is it important? How can you explain it to the American congressman who's going to say that the money is needed for other issues? And I think that's also the problem that all of you have stressed, is the need to position Ukrainian studies both within a general context, but also explain why it is particularly important. Now, as far as the crisis of the individual centers, and I was not aware that Kyiv is in any crisis, given the amount of material that comes out of it. It is certainly the most productive of the centers of Ukrainian studies. It reminds me of the problems of the 1960s that the individual small colleges had when facing competition from the larger state universities or from the larger, better funded institutions. And simply the argument that small is better. And in the sense of Ukraine, perhaps that is also an effective argument. Thank you.
Thank you. Rory, now it's your turn.
Okay. First of all, thanks to all our fellow panelists. I do think it's a great privilege, particularly for me, to be sitting up here with everyone, with scholars that I greatly admire and respect. I think all I'd like to say at the moment is that we need to be clear about the presentation of Ukraine as both a center and as an interstice, that is a kind of nexus I worry sometimes that when we talk about, let's say, transnationality and comparative work with Ukraine, that we mean we're going to be diluting, essentially, our focus in a disciplinary fashion on Ukraine and Ukrainian language material itself. I think we need to do both. We need to be thinking about how, for a prospective literary scholar, one can work on the once banned polemical pamphlets of Mykola Khvailovy in Ukrainian, or the early prose of Olya Kobylyanska in German, or the Sam Vedav Sam Izdat poetry of Boris Chichibabin from Kharkiv in Russian, the novels of Shamil Alidin in Crimean Tatar, and never leave the Ukrainian context at all. That's a really exciting prospect for any scholar of literature, but it makes, we still have to be, of course, equipping our students and cultivating our field with expertise in the variety of texts that simply aren't being studied any longer. We need to be looking more deeply into other areas beyond, let's say, canonical literary figures, into texts that were very widely read, but rarely studied. The recent inroads into studying Volodymyr Vinnychenko is really important, one of the great best-selling writers of the first half of the 20th century who slipped through the cracks. So I suppose all I'd like to say is that I think it's terrific for us to be thinking about all the ways we can incorporate Ukrainian material into Russian material, Polish material. I seek to do that. At the same time, I always wish to ensure that we work on the canon, that we do try to make central our focus on Ukrainian material. And I suppose the only one thing that I would mention before passing the baton to fellow panelists is, to a degree, it seems to me that for decades in Ukrainian studies, there's been, let's say, a lack of emphasis on undergraduate education. That we've been very good at funding, equipping, and training postgraduates. And that's been terrific. The issue is that I think sometimes we have students who come through their undergraduate career having worked in, let's say, Russian or Polish. And so by the time they get to their postgraduate career, they come to Ukraine as kind of a second destination. I really believe in teaching undergraduates, equipping them with the kind of theoretical methodological tools to handle complex Ukrainian historical cultural material, so that by the time they get to their MA program, their PhD program, they're already used to, let's say, fending off the very familiar Russocentric historiographical narratives. They're already accustomed to a variety of things that I think we need to be seeing from scholars of this region. So an emphasis on undergraduate education, I think, is something that we can really promote going forward.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Okay, I would dare to make a kind of a provocative, hopefully provocative comments, if I may. So first of all, we should keep in mind and always remember about enormous economic differences and inequality between those of us who work, like averagely speaking, in Ukraine and those who are not. You probably know how much people receive as professors or associate professors in Ukraine. I could give you the numbers. They are, incredible, and they are lower than the lowest fellowship for the students in Germany. And I've heard many times from my students, because they've stopped their academic career in Ukraine just to go as a student to Germany to start from the beginning. It makes more economic sense. And let us not pretend it's not a problem. It's a huge problem, especially, for instance, if you don't have your own apartment in Kiev or Lviv, and you should really pay for it. You could not pay for it if you just, a scholar. And it was my problem also for years. So we should really keep it in mind, because, here, generally speaking, we're in a company for well-established people who have no problems like that, but I really know what I'm talking about. That's first. Second, there is another inequality, no less interesting and important. It's an inequality between, it's kind of a generational inequality, if you wish. Now I'm talking about the difference between, let's say, people who started their real academic careers in Ukraine in the early 90s or the late 80s, and those who started like me in the, let's say, 21st century, and those who started now. Again, that's a very different context, and even the same fellowship from QUs, meant two different things in the 90s and when I got it, in like 2000 and like 2006 or 7. So let us seriously face this issue and not just pretend that it's it's a kind of abstract topic. It's not an abstract topic at all. And another point is a different one. I really very much support Rory's point about culture, because it's also very much the problem in Germany or in France. Like last spring, I've given lectures in Paris. It was the same problem. And one of the very practical suggestions, if I may, in this respect, if you look if you would like to give a student a good book, Ukrainian literature, to read in English, in German, in French, there will be a huge problem, because we have a pretty much of translations of the recent, present day literature. I would even say too much sometimes. And there is absolutely no translations of authors like Valerian Підмогильний, Victor Petrov Domontovich, actually those who could really, give a very positive, very modern view of Ukraine. And I was also given lectures on Ukrainian literature in Berlin, and I faced it that there is no chance you could give even Olесь Gonchar novels. But we know what Olесь Gonchar was, social realism, and there is no way to, you could just tell about Підмогильний. And that's a very huge problem, and I would really hope that at some point the best translators will not just translate, our young writers, we know the name, but, to translate Підмогильний, Domontovich, and authors like them. It's very important. And it's really, I would dare to say, it's something that is like a kind of an really a real task for all of us, and it will really influence our teaching of Ukrainian literature and culture outside Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Okay, I like to come back again to the war and what the war has exposed in the field, and the divisions that have been alluded to a bit before, and both the risks that we need to keep in mind all the time, because remember, the Soviet Union was an economy that wasn't supposed to fail, and a party system that was never supposed to lose an election. So risk is a much bigger problem than even what scholars are facing. But again, coming back to Germany, in Humboldt, which was mentioned by Andrei a couple of times, at Humboldt University in Berlin, two of my colleagues in Germany who are known as Russianists primarily, or at least were once known primarily as Russianists, and as Andreas Kappeler and Karl Schlögl, especially Karl Schlögl, have been leading the media and sort of educational prosvitnya activities to counter the Russian narrative. And most recently, Karl Schlögl wrote a book called Entscheidung in Kiev, in which he says the destiny of Ukraine is being decided in Kiev. And that's in a German language thing. And so there's, again, move where scholars who had a different relationship to Russia have now had some sort of an epiphany since 2014 that we need to help them with, because history is becoming a topic of war right now. I mean, the story of Crimea, whether it's Chersonesus and Vladimir, or whether it's the Crimean War of 1853-54, is being waged with historians and pseudo-historians and would-be historians, and again, in the American case, the war. I bring this example, a book that's out called Brothers Armed, Military Aspects of the Crisis in Ukraine. It came out in Moscow 2015. It's in English, and it's a translation. I think Ambassador Fraser mentioned Puchov, Ruslan Pusa. He's involved in this thing. And the foreword is written by David Glantz. And again, the reason I brought the New York Times is because David Glantz is cited as an expert on Soviet and Russian uses of maskirovka and other unconventional forms of asymmetrical warfare, and again, David Glantz is one of the most preeminent historians of Soviet army in World War II. Has written endless volumes. He knows the field, and I just want to give you something from his foreword. If the world is to contend with many new and often irrational challenges, it would be better served if instead of brothers armed, the armed forces of the Russian Federation and Ukraine, together with those of the United States and other nations, become brothers in arms. And in an earlier sentence, He writes, the geopolitical realities in today's world confront the Russian Federation, the US, and to a lesser extent Ukraine with common challenges whose importance far outweigh the fate of Crimea or the eastern provinces of Ukraine. And again, the sort of conclusion, the concluding statement is by another General Zwack, Z-W-A-C-K, which I pronounce as Zvatsk. And he writes, I myself, as an old Balkan hand that saw tangible, albeit itchy, U.S.-Russian NATO cooperation with S4 at a time few said it could have been possible, have always had a predisposition toward finding a way to work with the Russian military on the multitude of next-generation threats facing us both. We have much in common and need to focus on areas of potential cooperation. In closing, I must emphasize how much I admire and care for the Russian people and Russia's rich culture and respect the members of the Russian military. Needless to say, the current difficult state of affairs with Ukraine and Russia brothers armed must be resolved beyond forces of arms. So again, what I want to emphasize with this is that even in the American military, there is a kind of Russia hegemony that continues to, and it's expressed in these sort of American versions of brotherhood of peoples, the older brother, the friendship of peoples, and there's and on all of this, Mr. Zwack's statement, General Zwack says, there's not a word about Ukraine and his respect or love for admiration for Ukrainians who are also dying in this war, and he's an American of some kind of ethnic East European background, but the Russian hold on our discourse, and again, and Comrade Putin is making very good use of this, whether it's Trump, who's been mentioned a few times, or General Zwack and General Glantz, who are, again, experts on the Russian army, but seem to forget that there are other countries that are involved in these conflicts. And that's, again, a challenge that, I mean, I'm working on Hrystyuk and Shulgin back in 1917, 18. Dismantling the Russian narrative is again, something we cannot not do anymore. And I turn to Serhii Plokhy's book, Unmaking Russian Imperial History. I mean, that's what we have to do. And Ukraine is the best example. This is the best time to do it. And we need to not squander our opportunities.
Thank you so much, Mark. Serhii, now is your turn.
So, two brief comments. One on the use of social media, which David picked up on, and the other on the Ukrainian communities. On the social media, I think there is actually quite a bit of pressure from the university administrators to get involved in it, but in a way which is fundamentally misleading, because they encourage professors and graduate students to go online and tweet endlessly and put pages on Facebook, which then you realize like 15 people saw this page, and you know all of these 15 people, and you could have talked to them in the classroom instead, right? But of course, there is a different approach to that, and that is letting students run free and then come back with what they really like, because once you ask them about what you find new and exciting on social media related to Eastern Europe, you will realize there is an entire different world you have no idea about. And they would come, and then of course there would be a challenge to, weed out the stuff that they shouldn't in fact read, or should read with a very critical eye, and finding the stuff which they find quote unquote cool and you find interesting in terms of critical analysis. And in the community, I'm very privileged actually to be working with our small but going strong Ukrainian community in Victoria. Many of them are retirees from Edmonton, actually, escaping the snow. It's neither of our positions actually is funded by the Ukrainian money, but what they are doing is something very important long term. We are working with them to create scholarships, not necessarily very large ones. But what I realized that strategically over the long run, if you create 5 to 10 Ukrainian scholarships, that would mean that when you are retired and it's my turn to serve pierogies at the Ukrainian Center, then they are actually going to hire another Ukrainian specialist in the so-called Russian East European position, because they would want to spend all this money in the scholarships. And also, once I mentioned the pierogies thing, which should not be called pierogies, of course, I'm really grateful for their presence on Victoria scene, because everybody knows where the Ukrainian Center is. So many people line up around it for Friday night Ukrainian dinners. And it's an easy way for students to go and actually take a look and chat with our distinguished retirees serving these dishes. And actually, it's what universities talk about a lot, but rarely do satisfactory. It's the community-based learning. That's what it is. So as I keep saying all the time, I'm getting ready for the period when I am retired and I need to serve pierogies, and then, new generation will show up. I will know what to tell students, giving them the plate. Yeah.
Thank you so much. David, would you like to use the opportunity?
Let's try this way.
Yeah, just to comment on what I would call populism, including on social media, and it's kind of descended into manipulations of facts, manipulation of the truth. It not only applies to Russia today, I mean, it also in some ways applies to Donald Trump. If you listen to Donald Trump, it doesn't really matter what actually happened. It's just a matter of perception of what happened. And I think Russian media, quote unquote, I would say quote unquote because it's not really media, has kind of taken off in this regard. It's forged new paths in deception and pure lies. But also, at the same time, and someone mentioned this morning, it has used the Second World War as kind of the basis of the existence of the present Russian state, which is somewhat ironic when you consider how many nationalities took part in that war, and proportionally how many Russians died in that war compared to some of the other republics like Belarus and Ukraine. But nevertheless, that has taken place. And then the question is, how should one respond to that? How does Ukraine, for example, or how do people in Ukrainian studies respond to those kind of lies, which have impact? I mean, obviously they have impact because there are so many scholars today who have supported, by and large, Russia's version of why it's waging war in Ukraine, or in fact, as it sometimes says, not waging war in Ukraine, although recently Putin now has decided that he is waging war in Ukraine and did actually invade Ukraine. And this brings up the question of history, the questions of the past, something CIUS tried to do back in the 1980s, where it was really providing an alternative voice on Ukraine and Ukrainian studies. And I think World War II is probably the biggest single dilemma for Ukraine today. It simply doesn't know what to do about World War II. Recently I was in Ukraine. I visited the Museum of the Great Patriotic War, which, when you first enter, you find Russian tanks that were taken in the Donbass and brought back to Ukraine, just to show that Russians were in fact in Ukraine. But when you actually get inside it, it's almost exactly the same as it was in the Soviet period, word for word, with one exception. The exception is that now it also covers 1939 to 41. So there is a room devoted to 1939 to 41, whereas in the past Russia kind of denied that war even began in 1939. Some time ago in Kharkiv, one could actually find in one museum, actually it was the Museum of History, on one floor was an exhibit of the Holodomor, and on the second floor was the Soviet liberation of Kharkiv from the Nazis. That kind of paradox, really, has to be eliminated. And I don't really think the way the Ukrainians have gone about it, and particularly the National Institute of Remembrance, is the best way forward. That is more or less to replace old heroes, if Lenin was an old hero, old heroes with new heroes. We have our heroes. I think a more broader, more sophisticated approach is necessary. And I think that's something where Ukrainian studies in the West could play an important role.
Thank you, David. We have still 10 minutes or so to go with our discussion between us.
I have a minor question. There used to be in Germany a Ukrainian Free University. Is it dead now?
Maybe wait for our session of questions and answers then. Because we still have time to discuss between us, I believe. Should you? Would you like to answer?
As the Dean of the Philosophy
Faculty of the Ukrainian Free University. I don't think it's dead. It's not in its golden age, I would say that, and it's facing many of the same problems that we've been talking about, the sort of flight from humanities. And Ukrainistika, which is one of the faculties at Ukrainian Free University, is again one of the least subscribed to, because all the students, the Ukrainian students who are in Germany, well, not all of them, but many of them are looking for more practical and profit-making opportunities, including business and law and administration. So Ukrainistika, even at the Ukrainian Free University, is not in good shape right now. And I'm in philosophy. The department of, or the faculty of philosophy, handles history that's supposedly not Ukrainian history, but that's a complicated thing. Since 1991, Ukrainian Free University has not received German government support because of independence, and so it's relied increasingly, well, entirely on the diaspora fundraising efforts, and it is taking in, again, not only students who, for one reason or another, decided their future at the immediate point is not in Ukraine, but also a lot of faculty who are teaching from Ukraine on a regular basis every year, political science, history, literature, language. So it's going on, and it's but it faces many challenges too, and not ones that are all that different from the ones that Alberta and Arizona and other places are also facing.
Thank you, Mark. I will deduct those 2 minutes from our further discussion. Rory.
I just want to point out, we've said quite a lot this afternoon, we said a lot this morning, but there are two things that really stand out to me. First, a lot of the challenges and the, let's say, recipes, prescriptions for overcoming these challenges speak to the need for institutions like the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. That's for one. Number two, a lot of the ways in which we're talking about how we can package Ukrainian studies, reinvigorate Ukrainian studies going forward, speak to our capacity to build a market for more students, students who, let's say, coming from unexpected quarters. So in the first session, we talked about the problem of supply and demand, particularly with respect to academic jobs, a hugely important topic that we need to take very seriously. But that presumes a steady state with respect to the size of the market. And I think we could absolutely grow that for all the reasons that we've mentioned. And I do really want to agree very vocally with what Andrei said earlier about our colleagues in Ukraine, the state of salaries being abysmal. You've seen already, I'm sure, a number of pieces in Politico about academic corruption in Ukraine, written from a particularly, an individual perspective. This is something we need to keep addressing and pressing. For my part, I think I've failed in Britain to even convince authorities I've been in contact with in the border agency and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for quite some time, the Foreign Office, in at least reducing the cost of an academic visa to go to the UK. I mean, it's something on the order of £100, which is much more than a month's salary for an academic in Ukraine. And the way I often explain it to colleagues in Cambridge and also political officials is to say, well, can you imagine spending something like £3,500 for a visa to travel to Ukraine, for instance? Because that's the equivalent of a month's salary for an academic in the United States, or UK for that matter. So this is a really, really important issue that we can really only do successfully if we're working together on it. If it's just a few of us here and there in separate contexts, we're not going to have the desired effect. But we need these types of venues, these types of networks and institutions for us to do this more effectively. I just want to make that point more clear.
I just came to realize that I'm the only scholar who is here, came from Ukraine. So if I may I just, a few words, a few minutes that's left, provide some kind of Ukrainian perspective, which to a large extent is my personal perspective, but also this is perspective we're discussing very much in Ukrainian academia, but not only in academia world. And if I may touch upon the subject, I believe there are challenges of two forms. One is structural. And when we discuss the number of institutes we have to create, money to raise, salaries, books to translate, which is perfectly fine, because this is the bread and wine of the Ukrainian studies. It's so-called hardware. Without hardware, you couldn't function. But we in Ukraine, much more interested in the software, in the agenda. If we're creating a new institution, to what purpose? What we're supposed to do? Are we still continue the work that we done so far, good or bad? I believe good, but still, does it suffice? And I here want to refer to a kind of the very nice coincidence that at least there's been 3 scholars who don't really that much know each other. None of them is Ukrainian origin, lives in Ukraine, but which came to the same conclusion, and this some relates what Marta was saying, that postmodernism has ended, and it has ended in Ukraine on Maidan. Neither of them is Tim Snyder. Even so, one of them is his wife, Marcy Shore, who made this kind of conclusion. The other is Pomerantsev Jr., who wrote a brilliant book on the Russian propaganda, how it functions, because it says basically what is Russia is not a kind of imperial regime. It's per se, it's not sufficient. It's a perfect postmodern state, what he says there. And the other is Ilya Gerasimov, I believe the brilliant, probably the most brilliant Russian historian, who's now has to find a shelter in US because he was accused of being Western agent back in Russia. So what's important here, there are 3 scholars who came to the same conclusion. They believe that Ukraine stands in forefront in the processes that's going in the world, and also have some effect on the academia. Lilia Shevtsova, a name that I believe sounds to you, many of you sounds familiar. She is one of the most fierce critic of Putin, a liberal author who was the director of the Carnegie Fund in Moscow, then had to move to Washington for obvious reasons. By the way, she was born in Lviv, and she made this point once during the discussion. What is the problem with Ukrainian crisis, intellectual problem with Ukrainian crisis? It's not just we have to stand the challenge from Russia. It's that we don't have any book, not even shelter of the book they could grab to get explanations going in Russia. We don't have even a vocabulary how to describe this conflict. There are new concepts emerged, like a hybrid war. Who was heard about the hybrid war before? This is the first things. Or the new terms that has been very much during Maidan, which I don't believe has been presented any kind of the Ukrainian studies, precariat, which is very much generational aspect, which I believe holds the key to explanation why Maidan has happened in Ukraine. So to say, why there's such a lot of social energy in Ukraine, and most importantly, why this energy is not limited to Kyiv or Lviv only. Why it's in Lviv, in Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnipro, all these kind of things. So what I'm saying here is my impression, but again, an impression shared by my colleague in Ukraine, because for us it's very urgent issues. We haven't started formulate and to pose new questions. We're still with new questions. Without having new questions, right questions, we couldn't find a right answer, so to say. We're still dealing with the identity, with language, which is necessary. I'm not denying the importance of this issue, but they don't explain really what's going on in Ukraine. Just give you one example. For month and month, in the surveys on the most important issues in Ukraine, the language is getting 0% status of Russian language. Nobody cares nowadays in Ukraine, but we care. Look what our scholars writing, say in the United States, I would name the names, probably guess, that Ukraine is suffering from the language schizophrenia. Something has to be done. Probably yes, but if you don't deal with the language schizophrenia, then we refocus our attention on the most important issues, like corruption, like all the kind of things. So what I'm trying to say here, I believe that we're still very much stuck in the old agenda, which sounds very renovated, refurbished, but still it's very much about national identity, or identity per se, which is important, no way to discuss it, no way to deny it. And it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You couldn't get really understanding what's going on in Ukraine if you're just focusing on this idea. I have many examples, but I wouldn't abuse my time. But again, just probably final point, and here I refer what Mark was saying. There's no doubt that we have to find Putin on the front of identities and narratives, without a doubt. That's must. But if we find only on this front, we couldn't win, because this is his playground. He has much more resources, so to say. We just couldn't stand. And also what he's doing, we're replicating his discourse, in a way. By denying his discourse, replicating this discourse. And we're stuck with this kind of Huntington-like agenda. I know it for sure that Putin believes Huntington. I know it. I know people who say that actually he treats Huntington very seriously. You probably know that Putin is very much fond of the conservative thinkers, so to say, and Huntington included. In a way, I would say that he really believes the divided country, and where is this plan on the dividing Ukraine, on the Russian Spring, based by reading Huntington. But I'm afraid that many Ukrainian scholars read Ukraine the same way. Even so, they say Huntington, they still impose on the importance of the Russian language, all the kind of things they say. So if we deal with this kind of issue, we have no chance to win the war on the Putin's playground, because we still believe that national identity, nationalism, those kind of things, historical memory is very much important. Representation, which is very much part of this postmodernism, so say, agenda, so to say. Because I would say there are much more important, more real things to discuss than those kind of things. And I'm afraid we're not covering that. And my experience comes from the working in think tanks in Ukraine. There are several think tanks, both state and civic one, which are discussing, try to come with a new strategy for development of Ukraine. And to have the strategy, have some kind of vision. And believe me, there's no academic scholar in the think tank. Not just not willing, they have nothing to say when it comes to these things. See, it took me hard time to find statistics, an economist in Ukraine, who to provide me statistic of the share of the so-called service economy in Ukraine, which I believe is probably one of the most important phenomenon, that during the 0 years, there has been transformation in the sense the industrial sector doesn't cease to be the main provider of the GDP in Ukraine. Now the main part belongs to the service sector. So say, but again, even such a data you couldn't find, and I believe to a certain extent it's a result of our so say agenda, because we still provide this whole agenda. We believe things matter, which is perfectly fine. They matter, but then we don't have to probably discuss about the challenges, because this is a challenge, I believe, because you have to come with a set of ideas, with suggestions to help this country to fight with historical legacy, not with historical memory per se, but with, I believe, corruption is also part of the historical memory. Who will write the history of corruption in Ukraine? Who would explain why corruption is so persistent? Why it's so different, say, from other countries of the former Soviet Union, things like that. That said, I believe that Ukrainian scholars have a unique opportunity to formulate a new agenda, which would be new agenda for Ukrainian studies, which is important. But a new study agenda might be a new studies for humanities. And it's exactly what Gerasimov is saying. And this is a sense what post-colonialism, because Ukraine and Ukrainian scholars, I'm talking about Ukrainian scholars in Ukraine, definitely, have to start speak their own voice. And to speak their own voice, they have to formulate kind of new agenda. And I believe we're still very much missing this discussion along these topics. Thank you so much. And now we have a time for questions and answers. We have an alternative here. We may have either announced to make a 10 minutes break and then come back to this room, or we should start immediately with question and answers. So I see there is a preference for the second choice. So then, if I may ask, again, I have been warned that I have to highlight this is positive discrimination here. Even I don't see that many students here, but I believe there's still some of them here. So if you raise your hand, you have the preference. So I see some ladies sitting there. They look like very much like students. So please, questions. Pardon me? Why? No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
It's a nice question Народна асоціація україністів. Is that dead too, or I mean, these people would...
If I may answer very briefly, it's more dead than alive.
Because they should be doing the work.
No, hopeless. Believe me, they are very much hopeless. Very much like academia in Ukraine.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Professor Moser would agree with you about that, so that's interesting. But that brings up Vienna. So just one comment on what Yaroslav said at the end. I think it's an antidote to say that maybe much attention was paid to language. But it's not scholars abroad, but say it's the K of patriarchate. Each time it takes over a parish, talks about the right to pray in Ukrainian. The radio controversy about Ukrainian songs didn't come from scholars abroad. So there are still tendencies in Ukraine where we see language and cultural production there. So I think somewhere between what Yaroslav said and what Rory said, which were the opposite sides of this thing, where Rory wanted culture and language paid attention to. Then just on the general discussion, one thing that strikes me out of all this is that Ukrainian studies has developed differently, but always because of ability to take opportunities when they came up. So I thought specifically of Cambridge, right? We heard the story of Cambridge, and I want everyone to remember 200 students in the past 8 years taking Ukrainian at Cambridge University, right? Phenomenal, I would have said before. It took a number of things. One of them was that the Department of Slavic Studies wanted to do Ukrainian. Many years ago, Simon Franklin approached Ihor Shevchenko and said, can you find a Ukrainian donor in North America who has 3.5 million quid who could hand it over to us for studies? But they wanted to do it. The second thing, I think, is that they have academic spine in Cambridge to defend academic traditions, to not go along with whatever the last bureaucracy or dean says that wants to redo all studies, abolish this department, stick it there. You know, they kept Slavic studies, they knew how to develop it, and they've done it. And then it always takes a person who can do it. And in certain ways, Ukrainian studies can develop if we can take a chance of these opportunities if we've been able to provide support, which in some cases the Ukrainian studies community has done. The very different situation we've heard in Germany is a much more bureaucratized, government top-down society, usually in its organizations. But no one in Germany planned that Andreas Kappeler would get interested in Ukraine, right? Andreas Kappeler had a chair, decided he was interested in Ukraine, and then within a decade, German scholarship on history of Ukraine in the West jumped tremendously with one generation of his students. We had 8 or 9 or 10 basic monographs where you could argue that a graduate student in North America who couldn't read German now couldn't do many things that before would have not come out. So I think of that as another of these opportunities on it. What I fear it also tells us is that we get wedded to whatever structure we've got. You know, we are doing 40th years of this institute. Harvard will do its anniversaries. You get a model, it goes for a while, but it's not always going to work. And we've got to be ready to go on and change rapidly. And that you've got to bet on specific people. I mean, I think of Italy. Had Giovanna Brogi not been in Italy, you know, had she not done all she had done at that time, I mean, Italy was a leading force for the study of Baroque literature, on Ukrainian literature for a generation. It's not going to maybe continue now. We'll see. She's got a good student who's taken over. But each of these were opportunities for the field. And in that, every time I've dealt with my European colleagues, they've always expressed, oh, well, it's not like North America where you have the Ukrainian diaspora that can create a community and to go on and do it. But that's just a fact in the field. So just some general comments on the...
Thank you so much. We will collect probably another 2 questions and then we'll proceed with the answers. Some other questions, if I may. Alexander Melnik.
I'll ask maybe a little bit provocative questions since we're at the Ukrainian Studies Conference. So there's a little bit of temptation for each of us to engage in some kind of self-serving agenda there. That's normal. We all have our interests. But if we abstract ourselves from the field of Ukrainian studies itself and try to project sort of towards the real world that we study, to which we contribute in different ways. So if I were to ask each one of you, what do you see as the most important problem confronting Ukraine today, or the home societies in which we live? And the second question is, given your competencies and interest, what could you possibly see yourself doing to sort of alleviate the problem in the particular domain?
Thank you so much. Another question? If not, they probably will ask. Oh, there is a question here.
There has been mention earlier on about Cambridge University's great tilt towards the East and their Slavic studies, and how the Ukraine has benefited from it. If I might pose the question, is that some sort of atonement for the Cambridge University's production of all the Kim Philbys and the others from the 1930s who the traitors, the house of the traitors from England?
Thank you so much. Rory, since the last question was, I believe, addressed to you, may you start from the... You are the best specialist on the British Cambridge, and nobody other.
It must be an atonement for Kim Philby. There's a lot to atone for with Kim Philby. I would like to say that one of the proudest moments I've had at Cambridge actually is pointing to another alumnus named Gareth Jones. We all know him as the one journalist who put his name on the story of Holodomor, paid for that quite dearly. When I arrived in Cambridge, I actually, coming from a North American Ukrainian studies context, we're all aware of the name, and I'd gone to Cambridge thinking that everyone would know Gareth Jones there too. He was not known at all, even at his alma mater, Trinity College, where he performed first-class result in Russian, was invited to a lot of secret societies that people like Kim Philby joined. He always declined because he was worried about this kind of monolithic ideological thinking that secret societies invite. And we displayed his diaries that were put together during 1933 in particular, when he crossed over the border into Soviet Ukraine, wandered around Kharkivshchina, seeing the situation in the countryside. So now, instead of Kim Philby, often you'll hear Gareth Jones's name spoken about. However, when I bring this up, I also have to point out that guess where Walter Duranty went to university? So Cambridge has got, a lot to be proud of, a lot to atone for, but of course, all universities do, and one with 800 years plus, it's got a lot in the rear view.
Thank you. Rory, may you proceed with the question, with the answer to the Alexander Melnik question? The one issue that you should address, that you would like to address, and what would you do?
Alexander, is that specific to Ukraine, or just? I suppose really, truly, for me, I'm very perplexed by this epistemological problem that the study of Ukraine presents. I mean, why are we in this position? As Marta was saying earlier, or I'm not sure actually who brought this question up about, defending Ukrainian studies. It's absolutely right that we shouldn't have to defend Ukrainian studies, but why is it that certain areas of study, from African studies, Balkan studies, Ukrainian studies, why is it that they're considered niche areas? I mean, when one abstracts themselves, as you put it earlier, away from this issue, we try to think about our various individual intellectual journeys to our field of study. In the end, it's a massive territory, highly complex, geopolitically significant. The fact that actually we are in some ways marginal still baffles me. And I suppose that's the one problem that I can't quite get my mind around. Because even so, even after the war, or even during this war, we still encounter this problem. And these, as Slavko just put it, these problems keep sticking around, and we're not yet, with our colleagues, particularly in Russian studies, able to break free of these old kind of methodological, intellectual fetters. And we need to be thinking in radically new ways about a Ukrainian national identity, which, I would say is probably the most powerful and yet underestimated forces in modern European history. I mean, all the most renowned historians in this room taught me very clearly that Ukraine was composed out of three different imperial peripheries that were themselves civilizational peripheries in the eyes of the West. Yet somehow they created a new center for themselves in Kyiv. That's not supposed to happen. That's the defiance of geopolitical gravity. That's fascinating. So I suppose that general question of, why is it that we keep kind of revisiting these topics? Why is it that we can't get past them? I suppose that's the problem that I find myself, kind of scratching my head about, regardless of whether it's Ukraine or other contexts.
Probably David. I know. David, would you like to answer the same question?
Okay. I'd like to pick up on Rory's challenge, but also come back to Slavko's question about Putin and civilization and Huntington. And I agree with you that Putin does have a very not so simple-minded reading of Huntington. And when I talk about civilizational conflict, I'm kind of like with Eurasia. I'm kind of anti that sort of Huntingtonian. And I did come from Colombia, where Said was one of the leading critics of Huntington on Islam. And again, if you go back to I recently, for my sins, went back and reread Huntington, because I wanted to make sure when I talk about civilizational conflict, I was on some firm ground. Huntington didn't even mention Sunni and Shia when he talked about Islamic civilization, which is kind of the most important civilization for him in that book. But even when he talks about Orthodox/Slavic civilization, he assumes a kind of monolithic, unchanging, essentialist unity, which Putin would like to believe too. And when Putin talks about the Russian world and about Russian values and about decadent Western values and sort of all that good stuff, it's a kind of paradox in that this self-righteous, wonderful Russian identity of Orthodox Slavic morality is, on the one hand, is so superior to us, but it's so weak and fragile that we have to shut down alternate newspapers, we have to shut down alternate media, we have to fight against gay Europa, on all kinds of social media and up and down. So it's at once powerful, but very vulnerable and subject to contamination by these strange civilizational things. So when it comes to even his Orthodox, go back and read Huntington on Orthodox Slavic civilization. How does he explain an Orthodox Russia fighting against an Orthodox patriarch in Constantinople and Crete, with Serbian and Bulgarians against Ukrainians and others who, for the first time in, 1,000 years, there was an attempt to reunify Orthodox civilization that failed this summer. So where was this Orthodox, monolithic, uncontested civilization? Not to be seen. And then you have Orthodox Russia attacking Orthodox Georgia. You have Orthodox Russia attacking Orthodox Ukraine, ostensibly over Muslim Crimea. So is this, if anything, this war and Putin have exposed how simple-minded and how wrong Huntington was. And what was he wrong about? He was wrong in believing that these civilizations are watertight, hermetically sealed, unchanging and monolithic, and the only way they can exist is in a permanent clash, and that we, the West, have to keep all those other civilizations at bay. Instead, what we all believe, I think, and I tried this with Eurasia a long time ago, I didn't do anything but provoke a lot of controversy. Civilizations, cultures, societies are not one thing, but they're mixtures, they're migrations, they're boundary crossings. And thank you, Rory, for reminding us that Ukraine was at the 3 imperial intersections, internices. So that's the kind of civilization I mean. It's a civilization that's, again, hybrid, not watertight, not completely separate from others, but constantly, even Orthodox civilization lived with Jewish civilization and Islamic civilization and Protestant and Catholic Christian civilization. And so this idea that there's some sort of hermetically sealed, perfect Orthodox civilization is bunk. And that's what this, so we need to convince those people who believe that, including Huntington and Putin, that that's not reality, but they wished for that kind of reality. One other opportunity that I raised earlier that we haven't come back to is the 100th anniversary of 1917, which is the first Ukrainian state. And I know, and again, think about how is Russia going to mark that? Putin is obviously not going to like February because that's democratic. Even October is Lenin, and Lenin was guilty of all kinds of crimes, like giving away Eastern Ukraine to Ukraine. So Lenin is not good. October 1970. So what's left? The White Russian counter-revolution is, and again, if you look at what his favorite authors, Denikin, Ilyin, from that period, the only thing that Russia is going to celebrate, if anything, is the White Russian reaction and counter-revolution. Ukraine, by contrast, has the opportunity to celebrate the most democratic revolution it's had. It did fail, but why did it fail? Because the Bolsheviks didn't play by the rules. The Ukrainians were playing by the rules. They had a majority of the vote. They were willing to accommodate with Jews and Poles and Russians in a unique experiment of national autonomy, which again didn't last long, but it was the only country that did it on its own. And that revolution is not known by Ukrainian citizens today, I don't think. It's certainly not known in the West. And that revolution is something that is worth, I don't know, celebrating, but at least having a more positive intervention in the study of revolution. And that's why I mentioned I went to Israel for the first time. Why I went to Israel? Because of the Ukrainian Revolution in 1917, because we're planning a whole bunch of events next year to reconsider, revise, revisit what happened in 1917 and its impact to this day. And I was invited because I work on the Ukrainian Revolution in 1917. And if that's not an opportunity for us, I don't know what it is. I'm losing my voice again.
I'm going to have a very hard time to articulate what I want to say, precisely because I would love to continue this discussion on a very high scale of what would be the great issues, what issues Ukraine should be facing and how to do that. But I think that's one of the major problems that Ukraine has had. Maybe it's the end of the Soviet reliance on Kant and the need to always have an ideological justification. But from my long travels all over Ukraine, I've come to the conclusion that basically Ukrainian society is a quintessentially bourgeois society that really wants a good, decent life. And forcing people to come to a decision of what Weltanschauung, of what worldview they all have to accept is generally not top on people's agenda. I think it's necessary for us scholars to understand that we should write the books we want to write. I would personally urge Ukrainian scholars and Ukrainian journalists to write something readable and to try to publish what the recent emigres from the Soviet Union are now publishing in the New Yorker. We don't. Ukrainians don't publish. We publish in our journals. But once we and then publish whatever other books you want. But when it comes to practical issues, when it comes to what Ukraine needs, Ukrainian scholars and we all need to realize that we will always have an eternity of issues, and we will always keep trying to resolve this generational conflict, this marginalization. We personally will always be on the margins. All of this reminds me for the earliest sessions of the feminist movement trying to define yourself. For God's sake, you can't define yourself without defining your whole community. So what I think the Ukrainians should do is solve those issues that could be solved in whatever way needs to be solved, and let your children deal with the rest.
Just two very quick comments. One on language, culture, and society, which is something I have been thinking about as well. And I would argue that it's becoming increasingly difficult to separate these issues now, because in the course of revolutionary events, I think the Ukrainian language and culture acquired a status of a symbolic marker, which is attached to the concept of true democracy, anti-neo-Stalinism, against Putin, against the Russian agenda. And it's now kind of difficult to artificially, analytically separate them. So if it not necessarily even practicing the Ukrainian language and culture, but if a person demonstrates respect for them, that alone positions this person politically, I think, in a very important way. Also, I would argue that the core values of the recent revolutions were, in fact, civic and political. So this is the identity new Ukraine is building, but language and culture are the markers of that. But secondly, I thought that it would be important also to kind of issue a warning against walking into Putin's trap, which is what I see in present-day Ukraine quite a bit, especially in connection with the far right, which tend to get rejuvenated every time the elections are nearing, and somehow they are not at the front, but somehow they are right in front of the parliament and on Khreshchatyk, being funded from some rather obscure sources, which may in fact be connected to the Russian television, which is benefiting from actually seeing the picture of these people demonstrating in the center of Ukrainian capital with the various emblems and symbols, which look very much neo-Nazi. So that is playing right into the hand of Putinist propaganda, and there is, I feel a bit of a temptation in Ukraine and also among the younger public to identify with the most kind of extreme opposite of what Putin's Russia is. It's like the depiction of Bandera becomes acceptable on the Maidan because for Putin's Russia, Bandera is construed as the diametrical opposite of them. Not because people on Maidan read a lot of Bandera's work, so they joined the organization or anything like that, but because this is what Putin hates most. But this is the symbolic function, and there is always a danger that beyond that there would be an acceptance of political practices which would only play into Russia's hand, I think.
If I may, I believe the name of the young Gross doesn't need any kind of introduction here. All of us know, I just tell you the story that 2 years ago I met him in the Warsaw airport. He was returning from Moscow, he was working in the archive, and he has a presentation in the so-called Vyshcha Economic School, probably the best university in Russia nowadays, which is probably the best humanities. And he told me, he addressed me, you see, would you imagine where the world is heading to? I, American professor of a Jewish origin, had to defend Bandera before the accusations of the Russian professor and students. So just to show the idea, everything is mixed. American professor of Jewish origin defending Bandera against Russian students, who himself is very much disliked, mightily put in Poland for bringing the Jedwabne issue. So this is what I'm telling here, in what kind of complicated story we live, and Ukrainian things belong to this story, Bandera including. A British ambassador to Kyiv put it in a very nicely metaphor. I like this metaphor very much. He says that Ukraine confirms paradox of bumblebee. Because according to all the aerodynamic laws, bumblebee should not fly. And still it flies. According to all the theories, Ukraine should not exist as a viable state. And still it does. So this is beauty of Ukraine, because it defies gravity, laws of the gravity. And we are still following this law of gravity because we believe they're important. But this is something that we have to explain. In what way Ukraine is defying this kind of paradigm, this kind of the laws. So this is what I see probably the main challenge for Ukrainian studies, because I believe it's a Ukrainian riddle, Ukrainian paradox, but also I believe paradox of nowadays world, which becoming more and more also Ukrainian in that way. And talking about myself, I'm caught by transformation, by political events in Ukraine. This is quite different perspective being here. And I believe it will be very selfish to continue with academic career by writing a new book, 600 pages, that probably only 15% would read, so to say. So what I'm doing, I'm blogging, and I consider blogging as the very important part of the academic, say, agenda nowadays. You should provide some ideas to large audience, especially to this new young middle class, and it must be very short. Nobody reads more than 2 pages. And it's a challenge. Nobody reads more than 2 pages. And if their attraction is not caught by the first 2 paragraphs, forget it, they won't read your 3rd paragraph. So this is that. So going in this line, my ambition is to write a very short history of Ukraine. But very short, but global. In the sense of bumblebee paradox. Not going according to Hrushevsky, which I believe is important. Many people wrote according to Hrushevsky. Hrushevsky himself wrote better. Now they could better do better than Hrushevsky. But according to these books, interpretations, we deal with the countries like Ukraine, which explains this kind of corruption, authoritarianism, legacy of this kind of the regimes. In a sense, like you probably heard his name, Douglas North, Ronan Inglehart, who are not historians, who are political or social scientists, but who wrote global history of the world. And this is exactly what I believe Ukraine is now needed, because it provides a new perspective, helps to better explain what's going on in Ukraine. So this is my ambition, to write a very short but very global history of Ukraine according to those new lines.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll try to answer Alexander's question. For me, at least at the moment, one of the most interesting, maybe the most interesting aspect of what could be said about Ukraine is the question of the origins and nature of violence. I'm trying to write something about it, actually using your paper as well. And I think it's also incredibly interesting and helpful in this already mentioned transnational context, because you could perfectly use the story of the ex-Yugoslavia and also some parts of Northern Africa and so on to compare it critically. And of course, as you also know, we are doing all the time interaction web portal in Ukraine, historians.in.ua. Actually, one of our co-editors is also here, Alexander Pankeev. So it's his one more function of. And I should also tell you that it's done almost entirely without money. I could tell you the annual budget, nobody believes me, especially when talking to Russian or Polish colleagues who are doing the comparable projects. Their budget's like, hundreds of thousands of euros. Our is a couple of thousand euros. And yeah, that's okay. That's just to let you know that it's not just when I'm sitting in Berlin, and trying to, learn German. Not at all. I am trying to be very active in Ukraine, maybe even too active, and it also costs a lot in my, attempts to find something in Germany. And I would still, I'm very sorry for that, dear colleague, but I would still insist on the importance of the inequality very much. And I could give you 2 more practical suggestions. What could be done, at least theoretically. So first, Ukraine, I would say, desperately needs, but of course I don't see it like realistic in the nearest future, something like High School of Economics, already mentioned by Yaroslav, or even, if you wish, Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. Because in Russia and Kazakhstan, Russians and Kazakhs, as well as Americans, or Poles and whatsoever, they could go back to their country and work and teach and be well paid. In Ukraine, that's the reason actually why nobody goes back, almost nobody. Why everybody tries to stay, in Poland or in Germany or in Canada and everywhere. Because if you go back to this situation that was described by Rory. You have even no money to pay for the British visa, which was my case also a couple of years ago. So let us be realistic about it. It's crucial, and Russia has it, Kazakhstan has it. Ukraine has not. And secondly, no less simple, also have a number of examples. So it's not a kind of abstract vision. Maybe we need a kind of a program of translating of the very good books produced and published in Ukraine into English. because such programs do exist in Lithuania, in Poland, in some other countries, and I could even now give you the titles of a very good research published in Ukrainian, made by, let me be very precise. For instance, books by Valery Vasilyev on communism, by Gennady Yefimenko on Soviet politics in the early years, Volodymyr Maslichuk on Eastern Ukraine, and unfortunately they could not do it in English. And if we're really thinking about integrating the Ukrainian-based and Ukrainian language scholarship into international debate, maybe we need a kind of a program, something like that. So to do something real, not just talk about, beautiful concepts, but to make a real contribution to this better integration and functioning. Thank you.
Professor Maguchi.
There are 2 points that I'd like to share with you since we're in the discussion mode. I think the first is we should always keep in mind that we are already today and in general in a very luxurious mood. That is, we have the luxury to discuss a success story. We're really talking about the price of success. Ukraine has been an enormously successful, to use modern terms, project. 150 years ago, there were no Ukrainians. No one in the world knew about Ukrainians as a separate people, as a distinct language. Since 1991, there's an independent country that, against all odds, has now existed for 25 years. Now, whether one wants to use the metaphor of the bumblebee or not, really, we are talking about the problems of success, the challenges of success. The other thing is the direction of this panel. I'm a bit confused. We started this panel as in the context of this entire conference to discuss the past and present challenges of the academic enterprise of Ukrainianists, primarily in the West. What this panel was starting to do, and maybe what many of us get drawn off in, is Ukraine has a problem right now. Its greatest enemy is Putin. What should we, as academics, be doing to counter the activity of Putin in Russia? Well, excuse me, that's not our job. Our job is as academics. And we shouldn't be mixing up academic goals, scholarly goals, pedagogical goals, and activity with work as propagandists or political activists vis-a-vis an enemy state. That's for somebody else to do. And Yaroslav mentioned this, that, well, for him personally, what's the point of writing academic books anymore? For him or for you at this particular moment in your life, you feel it's more important to do your 2-minute blogs. Fine. But you said that is what academics should be doing. I don't think so. Public intellectuals. So if you want to move from the status of being an academic who was concerned with larger matters, long-term matters, that's one thing. If you want to be a public intellectual and go out on the barricades against the enemy, that's fine too. This is what I mean by I'm confused here, because I think it's very dangerous to move that along that slippery slope of being concerned first and foremost with scholarly, pedagogical, and academic matters, and then becoming as if we suddenly have a responsibility to be fighting against Putin. That's not our job. Thank you.
Who would direct? Or excuse me, David. I missed your turn. You have to use your opportunity.
I don't know now whether to make a comment about the last, whatever it was, really. I'll make a comment, and I think what Professor Margocci said is very pertinent, that academics shouldn't become politicized, and that's. But I don't necessarily think there's a real contradiction between someone using a blog and being an academic, if the goal is to simply disseminate more widely amongst an audience. Obviously, it's not a scholarly contribution. I would say also that one of the stipulations that seems to be emanating from the office of our president here is that we have to become public intellectuals. He said that directly. Basically then, for someone like Professor Margocci to stand up and say, well, we can't be public intellectuals and objective academics, doesn't seem to me to make a lot of sense. I think one can be both. Obviously, the line can be crossed at times, and there are academics who've become political activists. I could name 10 off the top of my head, but I wouldn't do it here. The goal, though, should be to avoid falling into that category, but I don't think one necessarily negates the other. I was going to make a comment earlier about Putin and about Russia, because I think the emphasis on Putin is overdone. I realize that if you're sitting in eastern Ukraine or somewhere like Dnipropetrovsk, that the threat is very real of conflict in your area. At the same time, I think to demonize Putin makes him much more powerful than he actually is. And I would ask, to take into consideration a couple of, not exactly statistics, but just information. The GDP of the European Union is 7 times larger than the GDP of Russia. Not the West, but just the European Union. The European Union is more than 3 times larger than Russia, whose population has been declining for the last 20 years. And when you're talking about Russia, you're talking about many autonomous regions that would in fact like more power from the center and have been deprived of power for the last 10 years. In other words, Russia is not a monolithic entity run from Moscow under one man, Putin. Putin is not even the most extreme of Russians by a long shot. There are people far more right-wing and quote-unquote fascist than Putin. So I think we give him too much credit, quite honestly, and I think the focus on Putin is really overdone when it comes to Ukraine. In fact, if you look at the summer of 2014 and the forces fighting among the separatists, Putin simply abandoned them, completely abandoned them and left them to their own fate. And it was not Putin's idea that they would suddenly move from Slavyansk to Donetsk. He didn't plan that. He planned to simply leave them to their own devices. He simply gave up because the concept of New Russia or Ruski Mir had clearly failed, mainly because most people in Ukraine refused to go along with it and were not interested in being annexed or invaded by Russian forces. And I think Russian leaders have actually seen that. And this is one reason why they don't know what to do with Donetsk or Luhansk today. So I think we can take that into consideration when looking at the future of Ukraine. I don't think the future of Ukraine is in any doubt. It's really a matter of looking perhaps more at regions than simply as one particular entity. Just as Canadian, if you look at the Canadian state, one could also say the same thing. It's divided into very distinct regions. What do we here, for example, in Alberta, really have in common with the Maritimes? Not a great deal. It's further away from us than, say, London is from Moscow. So I think more emphasis on the regions of Ukraine is important. And even, and this is something Volodymyr talks a lot about, border issues as well, because there are certain commonalities between border regions of Russia and Ukraine, just as between Ukraine and Belarus, just as between Ukraine and Poland. So I'll stop there.
As I understand, the question Professor Margocci has asked personally me. So I'm sorry if I no. But let me continue. But it's basically, public intellectual Hryzak was there. My name was mentioned. Correct. So I'm sorry if I provide a wrong impression that I force you to write blogs. God forbid. You're doing your work, you're doing brilliantly. That's okay. But the thing is, my point is, there's 2 points, first of all, that challenges depends from the conjecture, where you stand for, where you come from, what is the issues that you live in the society. And I believe, therefore, our perspective are different. There's one take, if you live in Ukraine and your colleagues going to front and all the kind of things, and you feel so endangered. So there's quite different pressure, and probably one is having this kind of luxurious, as you said. That's okay. It doesn't see that one is better, another is worse, just different, what I'm trying to say. Secondly, I don't believe there's anything wrong with being public intellectual. I believe it's very good. It's just issue of quality, whether you're a good public intellectual or bad public intellectual. Because sometimes more public you are, less intellectual you are. This is really the danger. And good public intellectuals are aware of this danger. So just let me provide you a list of very famous historians who has been public intellectuals, in my understanding, very good public intellectuals. Mikhail Hrushevsky was the first. I'm talking about professional historians, because Franko was also, but Mikhail Hrushevsky was the first. Ivan Lysak-Rutsitsky was public intellectual. Mikhail Drahomanov also could discuss whether he was a public intellectual or not. P.G. Taylor was intellectual, public intellectual. Ernst Gellner was public intellectual. He had wrote a lot of the pieces, short pieces of Guardian on academic-related issue. Tony Judd, that in many ways is my idol, and also who wrote to many extent Tim Snyder. This is the same ethos. He's public intellectual, or no, in Russian case, this is Dmitry Furman, which I believe one of the few historians who made the best insights in understanding what is the real difference between Ukraine and Russia. He was a very good historian, but he was public intellectual. And do read a large essays, actually 2-part essay of Perry Anderson in London Review of Books on Dmitry Furman. Because it says he both was brilliant historians, but also he was very good public intellectuals. Final point. The book which is very much discussed nowadays, History Manifesto, written by the Dean of Harvard Department. I believe he knows him personally, probably ask him later. Because it basically says, his main point is that what's going on in the world, there is a whole impression the world is going wrong direction. And why important is going wrong direction? Because we lost the sense. Because many of the issues that we're facing now are not short-term issues. There's not snapshots. They have long-term reasons. And to explain them and to find them, you have to apply long-term perspective, which means historian perspective. Who will do it? Economists, political scientists, politicians? This is something which historians have to do. Therefore, historical manifesto ends up that historians should stand up and fight. Again, I'm saying it's not kind of a must. I'm not saying that everybody has to be historians, have to teach public history, which probably it's not a bad idea to have a public history. But I say at certain point, for certain people, being public intellectuals means not necessarily bad things.